All right, welcome to Module 16, where we're going to be starting our discussion on the body systems. This chapter, I guess you should say, is going to take two modules to finish. So we're going to start our discussion on body systems in this week's module, which is Module 16, and then we will finish our discussion on body systems in next week's module, which is Module 17. All right, so we're going to start with a basic introduction to body systems. And so if you remember from earlier modules, we had our hierarchy of biological organization, right? Where you start with an atom being the smallest unit in living organisms. Atom, multiple atoms can make a molecule. You have multiple molecules that can make a cell, multiple cells make a tissue, multiple tissues will make an organ, and then multiple organs will make an organ system, right? And so this is the level we're going to be focusing on in this chapter, where we're going to go through kind of all of the major organ systems that are in the body. And we're going to specifically focus on human organ systems because organ systems do differ um, depending on the organism that you're looking at in terms of animals. Um, and so not all organ systems are the same, which is obvious, but we just want to make that distinction. And now, why do we have our organ systems? Well, first off, organ systems are, like we mentioned, multiple organs that are working together to accomplish a similar function. And so, for example, the digestive system, which is shown here in this image, that's the organ system we're looking at, is responsible for breaking down food, making sure that our bodies take up the appropriate nutrients from that food and the absorption of water from that food. And so taking up those nutrients and water from the molecules that we eat is just one part of the goal to help maintain homeostasis inside of our bodies. And so homeostasis, we'll mention this in more detail in the next couple of slides, is this steady internal state that our body is trying to reach so that the cells can undergo their cellular processes, metabolism can happen, and basically everything wants to work as optimally and efficiently as possible. And our processes are evolved to do so under certain conditions. And our organ systems help to maintain that steady state so that all of those processes can work as efficiently as possible. And now the homeostasis or the state of homeostasis is maintained by, like we mentioned, obtaining nutrients through the digestive system, removing waste from our body, which is in the blood. So the circulatory system, the urinary system are some of the big ones, respiratory system, for example, and then also to coordinate activities within the body and with the environment. So the nervous system is a big one there, the integumentary system, so our skin. And so there are many organ systems associated with our body that are all working together to make sure that we maintain this state of homeostasis. And so, for example, here we have this Arctic fox. It's a very complex animal, as all animals are, well adapted for its environment. And even in this cold environment, its body is able to maintain a constant temperature. It's able to maintain that state of homeostasis so that it can work and function as efficiently as it can in this specific environment. And now, what homeostasis is exactly, right? So again, I've mentioned this, but it's just the internal steady state that is maintained by living organisms. And you achieve this state through the use of organ systems. And our organ systems regulate, for example, our blood glucose levels, our body temperature, carbon dioxide levels in the blood, and many other things, right? This is just a very small portion of the features and variables that our organ systems control and regulate to maintain a constant temperature, to make sure there's enough oxygen in our blood, to make sure there's not a lot of carbon dioxide in our blood, so that our body can work and function appropriately. And all of these examples and all of the regulation mechanisms are ran through or controlled by what is called a negative feedback mechanism. Okay. And a negative feedback mechanism, or a negative feedback loop, is you can think of your thermostat in your house as a negative feedback mechanism. So you go to your thermostat and you set it on a temperature you want the interior of your house to maintain. And let's say you want to keep it at 73 degrees Fahrenheit. So you'll set your thermostat on it. Right? And if your house temperature warms up higher than 73 degrees, then the sensor that determines that will tell the air conditioner to turn on, and then the air conditioner will blow out cold air that will cool the house down back to 73 degrees. The opposite happens when you go below 73 degrees. The heater will come on and it will heat your home back up to 73 degrees. And so this is a negative feedback. That example is a negative feedback. So it's the negative feedback is whatever change is happening, there is something that is causing an opposite change, basically to go back to that set point. Body temperature is another good example. So when our body temperature rises, our blood vessels will dilate, resulting in heat loss to the environment. So dilate meaning they get larger, and so they become close to the surface of the skin. Heat is lost through the skin. We will sweat. And then as the fluid evaporates, we lose heat from the body. So we lose heat to the environment, and that lowers our body temperature back to our normal body temperature. And then the opposite happens if our body temperature falls. The blood vessels will constrict, so you conserve heat. The blood vessels aren't as close to the surface of the skin. You do not sweat. Instead, your muscles will contract very quickly. That causes shivering, and that contraction generates heat, and heat will be retained, and then your body will warm back up to the normal body temperature. And so, typical negative feedback mechanism that exists to help control and maintain that steady state within our bodies. Now, there are specific parts of a negative feedback loop that you need to become familiar with. And these parts are labeled in bold here. So we bolded those. And so your first is a set point. That's basically the value that the variable of interest needs to be maintained at. So for example, our blood needs a fairly neutral pH, and a neutral pH is a pH close to 7, because our red blood cells are more efficient at binding oxygen at a neutral pH. So our bodies have a set point of a pH of around 7 for our blood. So that is our set point. That's the set value, just like our body temperature is around 97, 98 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Now, there are sensors, or what's also called a receptor. It just depends on like what textbook you look at. Those terms are interchangeable. But the receptor or sensor is what determines the change or senses the change in that variable that's being measured. And it senses that from the stimulus. And that stimulus could be, heat causing your body to heat up, or carbonic acid, CO2 entering your blood to cause it to become more acidic, etc. Right? And so once that receptor picks up the change in that stimulus and the value changes from that set point, that information is relayed to the control center. Okay. And the control center will then to take that information and it will say, okay, the pH in the blood has went down. So I need to make that pH go back up. And so it will send information to the effector. And the effector is an organ that causes an appropriate change that will cause the set point to go back to what it's supposed to. So in the blood pH example, maybe the body will release bicarbonate, right, to neutralize the acid and cause the blood to go back to a normal pH. Or in terms of temperature, right, if your body increases, then you will sweat, and then the sweat will cause the body to release heat, and then you'll go back to your 37 degrees Celsius body temperature, right? And so you have those key factors, those key pieces: your set point, your receptor, your control center, and your effector. Right? So those are really important for helping to maintain that negative feedback loop, because those negative feedback loops are what maintains homeostasis. Now, a part of homeostasis that's really important and pretty well studied in animals is thermoregulation. Now, thermoregulation can be different between animal groups. You basically have two categories of thermoregulation in animals. One of those categories is endotherms. So an animal can be endothermic, and the second is an ectotherm. The animal can be ectothermic. Endotherms maintain a constant body temperature regardless of what the environmental temperature is. So if it's, for humans, we're endotherms, right? So if it's 30 degrees outside, if our body is functioning properly, our internal temperature is going to be 37 degrees Celsius. Whereas an ectotherm is their body temperature is similar to that of the environmental temperature. If it's 10 degrees outside, then their body temperature is going to be 10 degrees Celsius. If it's 20 degrees Celsius, then their body temperature is going to be fairly close to 20 degrees Celsius. It's almost a one-to-one trend line, and you can see that in this graph here. So the blue is a reptile, a snake, which is a typical ectotherm. It has that one-to-one relationship, that linear line. And then the bobcat, which is an endotherm, all vertebrates, typical vertebrate, I wouldn't say all vertebrates, I should say mammals. Your mammals are endotherms. A snake is a vertebrate, and obviously is an ectotherm, right? But your mammals, like a bobcat, is a typical endotherm, right? So if the temperature is lower, it's still around 37, degrees Celsius. Now, the way endotherms can maintain that constant body temperature is through several different mechanisms. But one of the main mechanisms is they generate heat through cellular processes. And an example of that is metabolic heat. So through metabolism, our cells will generate heat that helps to keep our bodies at the appropriate temperature. But now there are also specialized mechanisms in animals that allow them to either conserve or dissipate heat. And the different mechanisms that you can see in different animal groups will vary, but in general, they'll have some sort of insulation. So that could be fur, it could be fat or thick layers of blubber. It could also be insulating feathers. Um, you can shiver, which is what we see in humans, for example. You can also have vasodilation and vasoconstriction. That is the dilation and constriction of the blood vessels to allow heat loss and to conserve heat. So when your blood vessels dilate, which is shown here in this image, they get larger and they allow more blood flow close to the surface of the skin. And so that heat can be lost across the surface. And then when they constrict, they reduce the amount of blood flow close to the surface of the skin, and so you don't lose as much heat. I guess I should say examples for, the fur, the fat, and the feathers. You have this baby seal here, which has good fur insulation, also some fat and some blubber. The walrus is a really good example of blubber use for warmth, very, fatty animals. And then feathers, we've got this owl here, which you can see. And so there's different layers of feathers on that bird. And again, they cause the hot air, or they cause air to warm the body, basically be trapped against the body. Another interesting mechanism that animals can use is called a countercurrent heat exchange. And we've got that image right up here. And so basically, you'll have blood, arterial blood, flowing next to the venous blood. Okay, so artery carry blood away from the heart. All right, we'll learn that in next week's module when we talk about the circulatory system. But arteries carry blood away from the heart, and then veins carry blood back to the heart. Okay, and actually I lied. We'll learn about that today, or in this module. Yeah. But anyways, arteries away from the blood, veins is away from the heart, veins is to the heart. Okay. But what's interesting about this kind of setup where the veins and the arteries are flowing next to one another is that if you notice, towards the interior of the body, the temperature of the blood is very similar, right? But then as you move away from the interior, which is down, there's a difference in the temperature of the blood, much colder, right? And so what happens is there's a gradient, a heat gradient. And so heat will move through conduction from hot to cold items or substances. And so since the arterial blood is slightly warmer than the venous blood, the heat will dissipate over, right? So notice it's 35, 33, 30, 27, 20, 18, 10, 9. Even though those are small differences, it still matters because the heat will move from the warmer to the cooler blood, warming the blood up as it's traveling back towards the heart. And so this will cause that blood to be warm by the time it gets back to the heart. And you can see that countercurrent heat exchange mechanism in, say, like a flipper on a dolphin or a whale. Right? You see that blood flow from the arteries coming out. It gets cold when it comes to the exterior. And then the venous blood is going back, but it's going back adjacent to that artery. And so that countercurrent heat exchange will happen there, causing that blood to warm up before it gets back to the heart. Now, the last picture we have here that I haven't really described, which falls under the kind of vasodilation and vasoconstriction, is one of my favorite examples of cool mechanisms and how animals can regulate heat. This is an elephant, and elephants have very big ears, right? And kind of the more common theme with elephants' big ears is that they can like flap them to cool themselves off, right? It's like a big fan. But what a lot of people don't know is that elephants have a lot of blood vessels in their ears, and their ears are also really thin. And so that means that they can shunt a lot of the blood up into their ears when they get hot, and it will be close to the surface of the skin, like in this image, and they can release a lot of heat through their blood vessels in their ears. And then if they want to keep cool, then they can reduce the blood flow to their ears and keep it in the core portion of their body, and they can remain cool, and they can keep their body warm, keep the heat internally. And so just a really cool mechanism, and this is called a thermal window, which is really neat. And so there are actually lots of examples of thermal windows in the animal world. If you're interested, just Google thermal window in animals, and you can see and learn a lot about it. Next, we're going to finish up this video, this portion of the module, talking about osmoregulation. Now, osmoregulation is the process where you maintain the salt-water balance in the cells of your body. And this is referred to as the osmotic balance. Okay? Now, within our body, we have electrolytes, we have fluid that sits between our cells. This is known as interstitial fluid. And that interstitial fluid and those electrolytes are traveling in and out of the cells of our bodies. Okay. And so electrolytes are basically compounds that dissociate into ions when they dissolve in water. So if you get electrolytes and they dissolve in the water within our cells, they will dissociate into ions, and then you will have solutes either in the interstitial fluid or in the water that's inside the cells. And now, if you remember from our osmosis discussions, the water will move from high solutes to low solutes. And so this osmoregulation is our body regulating cell volume and solute content through various mechanisms within our body. So for example, one way we do this is through the urinary system, and the urinary system will control how much water is in our bodies, basically. And so in our urinary system, we have our kidneys, and it helps to regulate the concentration of water in our blood and in our cells. So for example, if our body has not taken up enough water, then our kidneys will conserve water and produce a concentrated urine. If we have too much water, then our kidneys will release water and create a diluted urine. Um, and so you've probably noticed this, that if you haven't drank a lot of water, your urine will be the color of apple juice, which means it's very concentrated, and you're most likely dehydrated and you should drink more water. Whereas if your urine is almost clear, then you're taking in enough water and your body is releasing the excess. And so the kidneys are important for helping to control that osmoregulation, that water solute content that exists within our cells. So basically that water electrolyte relationship. Okay. And we mentioned the kidneys as helping to control osmoregulation, but there are some other systems that help to remove waste from the body as well. You have the excretory system, and I should say that these three systems are part of the excretory system, right? So you have your respiratory system, your endocrine system, and then your urinary system. Okay. Your urinary system has the kidneys, which we've already talked about. It also has the urinary bladder, the ureter, and the urethra. Okay. So we're going to go into a little more detail, especially with the kidneys and how exactly they control that water solute balance. Now with the kidneys, which are pictured here, so I should say here is the urinary system. The kidneys are located here, right? And the kidneys have the ureter that takes the urine and brings it to the bladder, which stores that urine. And then whenever you excrete the urine, it goes through the urethra and out the body. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to zoom in to one of these kidneys, which is what we've got pictured up here. And so these are the various structures found within the kidney. Now the kidney can be divided into three regions. You have the outer cortex, which is shown here. You have the medulla, which is here. And then you have the renal pelvis, which is kind of where this yellow tubule area looks like. And the renal pelvis is where the urine will actually drain and filter into the ureter. Okay. Now within the medulla and the outer cortex sits a structure called nephrons. And there are many, many, many nephrons in a kidney. And the nephrons are the actual functional unit of the kidney. They are the unit, they are the structure that is filtering the blood of metabolic waste and is what is developing and deriving the urine. And so here's a figure of a nephron. So this yellow tubule here, right, is a nephron. You have this Bowman's capsule, which holds a bed of capillaries, and those bed of capillaries is called a glomerulus. And the plasma out in the blood will be filtered in this glomerulus. There's little pores in these capillaries that allow the metabolic waste to move out into the Bowman's capsule. And then once that happens, it then runs through the nephron, and it goes through the descending limb, through the loop of Henle, through the ascending limb, okay, and then through the collecting duct down to the ureter. Okay. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail, but what I want you to know is that as this structure, I should have found a figure for this, is located kind of like this. So you have like outer cortex, the loop comes down, and you have the tube that enters into that. So that's kind of the way it looks like. So this right here would be like the loop of Henle. Now, as this kidney has a gradient in terms of solute concentration, right? So there's more and less salts across this gradient. And what that does is it causes water to either move out or to be stored inside of this loop. And then depending on whether or not the body needs to store more or less, or if it needs to store more water or remove water, the collecting duct will allow water to move out or stay in. So if the body needs water, it will allow it to move out. If it needs to be removed from the body, then it will travel to the ureter and be excreted as waste. Now, our blood is filtered about 60 times per day, which is pretty crazy. That's a lot of filtering by our kidneys. And so it's important that you know, that we have healthy kidneys, and if not, we can be in serious trouble. And there are several issues that can come from that. One is that we can't get rid of our metabolic waste, and that can be a real detriment to our body and its functions. And then once the urine is, or I should say, once the blood is filtered and the urine is made, it then goes through the ureter down to the urine bladder where it's collected and then released whenever it needs to be excreted. Okay. All right, and so that pretty much does it for chapter 16, section 1. The next video in this module, we're going to look specifically at the digestive system, which is 16.2. And so with that, that's it for this video, and we'll see you in the next one.